I've been in therapy since I was 15 or 16 years old, so about half my life. And in these years, I've had a lot of great therapy. I've had some pretty shitty therapy. I've had some therapy that absolutely fucked me up. And I've also just had some really strange shit. Therapy was a really far off concept to me when I was young. First of all, mental illness was never talked about. Like in my family, that was incredibly taboo. There was very little education about it. And while I had been experiencing depression almost all my life, my depression started when I was about 4 years old. There was no recognition of it, no even language for it. So I didn't know that's what was going on with me until it got to the point that I was suicidal. I recognized at the very least that there was something wrong with me, and I could tell that much. I could tell that I had these feelings that were out of place. There was no reason for them. They were persistent. I would cry every day. I felt incredible guilt knowing that there were people out there who actually deserved to feel like this, like people who were going through real trauma and grief, while I was just some kid. So why should I be feeling this way? I'm not deserving of it. Little did I know that my lifelong depression was just the tip of the iceberg in a multitude of symptoms and diagnoses that resulted in a psychiatric disability. My twin sister was actually the first person in my family to get into therapy. And that opened a door for me. Like that swung open a door for me, because until then, I had no idea that that was an option. That was never talked about. So even the idea that someone in my family could go to therapy blew my mind. And I realized, oh my God, I have a chance. Like I can do something about this. Unfortunately, my mom, she's very negligent. She's a huge source of my childhood trauma. She's a huge cause in what developed into CPTSD and borderline personality disorder. Like she is the primary reason that I've acquired a psychiatric disability. And part of that reason was because she let my sister go to therapy, but she wouldn't let me. She told me that I was attention seeking and that I was trying to take attention away from my sister who actually needed this. So I didn't get the help I needed, at least not right away. It took a lot of convincing actually to get her to believe me that I needed therapy. She told me later as an adult that the reason she didn't believe me was because she was in too much denial to accept that she had two sick children who both needed care. So she would only allow it for my sister. She could only handle one sick kid. In her words, ultimately my suicidality reached a point where I was not being heard. I was telling her I was suicidal, that I wanted to kill myself. She continued to tell me that I was looking for attention, and I took it into my own hands. I went to the school counselor and I told her that I wanted to kill myself. She essentially made my mom put me in therapy. So if I had not done that, who knows where I'd be. Even though I wanted therapy very badly, when I started, I didn't know what to say. So I didn't say anything. And weeks would go by where I would just sit there in silence for the entire hour. And my therapist, she could not pull a single word out of me. She could not get me to speak. And I really wanted this, but I didn't know what to say. I was very scared. I had never talked about my problems with anyone. So I was pretty stunted emotionally. Like I could not open up. Like feelings were so repressed in my family. You didn't talk about that. So talking about it with a stranger was like a mountain, like trying to climb a mountain. What worked was when she pulled out some paper and crayons and she let me draw. And when I started drawing during my sessions, I like immediately opened up and I started telling her everything going on with me, all of my feelings, my relationships with my friends, what was going on at home, how I wanted to kill myself, how it wasn't getting any better. She really, really listened. She was an amazing therapist. Like she may be my favorite therapist, maybe, because she actually did get through to me, but I was so far off, like I was so bad off that I actually went to treatment. I left I left high school, in my senior year, and I ended up in a therapeutic boarding school. The therapy I received in boarding school was very, very different, and it did not help. My treatment center focused on my drug and alcohol problem, which I didn't have. There were rumors in my town that I was an addict, but at the time that I went to treatment, I had never been drunk. I had never finished a beer. I had never tried hard alcohol. I had smoked a little bit of weed, but I didn't even own a pipe. I smoked it when my friends had it. It wasn't a habit. And when I went to treatment, my parents told the treatment that I was an addict based off of what the other parents were saying and not what I said. So, when you're like a delinquent teenager, no one believes you. They're not going to take your word over the parents who, were very misinformed. So while I did belong in treatment for the abusive relationship I had been in with an ex-boyfriend who became my stalker, and for the untreated schizoaffective disorder that had resulted in my first psychotic episode, which no one seemed to realize even happened. There was a lot going on, and drug and alcohol problems were not part of it. So my therapist really only focused on that, and she would not listen to me when I would talk about my abusive relationship and how that was my real problem. She would not talk to me about my family dynamic. She didn't want to hear any of it because it was deflecting from the problem of drugs and alcohol. And I denied that I was an alcoholic because I absolutely was not. I had never been drunk. There was no fucking way I was an alcoholic, but no one believed me. And she told me that I couldn't graduate forward in treatment unless I admitted my alcoholism, so I lied. I lied my way through treatment because it was bullshit and they wouldn't take me seriously. And I told them what they wanted to hear so that I could graduate on to the next level. But in reality, I absolutely was not an alcoholic, and I wasted a year of my life in a treatment that didn't listen to me, didn't help, just kind of sent me backwards. My second treatment really made it worse because when I did try to advocate for myself and talk about my abusive relationship, my therapist there said that I was codependent. And so she focused on my codependence issues and not on my trauma. And, that really set me up for failure in the future because having not addressed the abuse, I couldn't recognize abuse in the future, and I accepted a lot of it. That sent me backwards too, focusing on my part in the abusive relationship and why I allowed and enabled the abuse did not validate in any way the trauma that I had gone through. So that sucked. And actually, the only person in that treatment to recognize that I was in there for the wrong reason was my drug and alcohol counselor. She was the only one to say, I don't know why you're here. You clearly aren't an addict. You're clearly not an alcoholic. So what are you doing here? And I'd be like, oh, well, finally, thank God someone listens to me. I'm not an addict. And for some reason, the drug and alcohol counselor was the only person who got that. So treatment didn't help. It sent me backwards. It absolutely erased all of the progress I'd made with my first therapist. And like I said, I wasted a year of my life going backwards, making backwards regression instead of progress. And I did go into more abusive relationships. I feel like I had been somewhat gaslit. I know that's a really overused term, but I had been pretty well lied to in therapy that no, you're the problem. You didn't go through abuse. You just won't own up to your side of the street. You're deflecting from how you played a part and blaming it on this man who hurt you. And you're exaggerating the story to cover up your drug and alcohol issue. That's what I got out of treatment. From then on, it was pretty spotty. And there were a lot of stretches of time where I wasn't in therapy. And during these periods of time, I was not doing well. I did end up getting into drugs. I never really got into alcohol though. I drink, when I drink very rarely. If I buy a 6-pack, it'll stay in my refrigerator for about 2 months before I finish it. So I typically would drink maybe a beer or two every 4 to 6 months. That's the kind of drinker I am. But addiction, that's absolutely something I'm familiar with. And I did get into that after the fact, which I don't know if that's irony or not. I don't understand irony, but having gone to treatment for a drug and alcohol problem that I didn't have, and then leaving and immediately getting into drugs. It's just kind of funny. When I finally got back into therapy, it was in college, and it was supposed to be for trauma, but from the very first session, my therapist completely cast me off. I had written on my application or whatever, in my forms, that I had been raped by my ex-boyfriend, which was true. And when I went into that first appointment and she said, okay, well, it says this here, what's that all about? I said, yeah, my ex-boyfriend, he sexually assaulted me. And she said, but he was your boyfriend. And I'm like, yes. She was like, you'd had consensual sex before then. And I'm like, yes. And then she just brushed it off. She let me know very clearly that I had not been sexually assaulted because I had agreed that every single time I'd have sex, it would be consensual. There's no room for taking your consent back. So yeah, I didn't get any help for that either. And this was, continuing the pattern of not getting the care I needed, further putting me into situations where I could not recognize I was being abused because I'd been gaslit by therapists into thinking that I was the problem, I was exaggerating, I was putting blame on other people, and I would not own my side of the street. So all of this trauma that had accumulated across all these therapists amounted to nothing. I didn't get any help for it. I didn't get any trauma therapy. I still actually haven't gotten any trauma therapy. And, it got worse. It got worse and worse and worse until it got to the point that I had dropped out of college. I was living in Washington. I was disabled at this point, psychiatrically disabled, and going into psychosis. The therapist I had that time, she actually helped, and she was a godsend, and she really saved my ass. In my first appointment, I was telling her about that ex-boyfriend that had sexually assaulted me and how he and his mom were both abusing me. And she said, it sounds like they were bullies. And I said, no, they were not. And she said, well, can you think of having been bullied? Like, have you ever been bullied? I said, no, I've never been bullied. She said, well, how about you think back to the first time you ever bullied? When did that happen? And this curtain fell in my mind, and I suddenly realized that every freaking year of my life leading up till then, from the time I was 4 years old through preschool, kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, there was not a year I had not been severely bullied, and it blew my mind. She got through to me. She was the first person to say, you have PTSD. And not only that, you have CPTSD, which is complex trauma. It is essentially PTSD on steroids. It was the first time I was able to work through what chronic trauma looked like and actually have it validated that that's what I had, and that it was not just the abusive boyfriends and the sexual assault. It was my family. It was the physical violence in my family, the physical abuse, the neglect, the manipulation and gaslighting, the emotional, withholding, right? Like withholding my emotional needs, if that makes sense. Like holding it over my head, dangling it like bait. I will only help you if you this. Conditional love. Like all of this shit added up into year after year after year, what I thought were minor infractions culminating into severe PTSD. Unfortunately, like I said, I was going into psychosis, and that put a huge halt in my therapy, and it was like really, really, really hard to recover from and to accept what had happened. Like, I didn't know what psychosis was. I didn't know what had happened to me. People would tell me, like, you've just been psychotic, and I could not wrap my head around that. So when I got the new diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, I just rejected it. Like, I could not accept it. It's not that I was trying to deny it or anything. It's that I couldn't understand what had happened to me. I couldn't grasp what was going on. I didn't understand, like, what my brain had gone through. It was maybe a survival mechanism, but for some reason it just didn't click. And even though I heard the word schizoaffective, I just didn't realize that that was me. After I did stabilize and recover, come out of psychosis, yada, yada, yada. I guess I stopped seeing her. I guess somewhere along the lines, I just never made another appointment, which was okay because I ultimately moved. And when I moved, I started going to one of those like clinics, and they're great, but I didn't really get anything out of it because every week that I'd go, my counselors would be like, you know, how was your week? And they would just want to hear about my week. They would never talk about my actual issues. They would never talk about, you know, my trauma, like anything that I actually needed help with. And because I am very bad at advocating myself and very bad at asking for help, I would just go off of their questions of how was your week? What did you do this week? And just asking what did you do this week does nothing for me. Nothing. Because yeah, I do struggle with day-to-day things, but the reason I struggle with day-to-day things is because it's on top of this huge mountain of trauma and brain damage and, you know, impaired cognitive abilities and maladaptive coping skills and trauma responses and triggers. And when none of those are addressed, all I'm really saying is, oh, I went and I did my groceries. Nothing came out of that. I went through every single counselor that they had and didn't get any help from any of them. And I went to that clinic for years, and, you know, it was just kind of placating things. It wasn't helping. And I thought that I was like fine. Like I thought that I was better. I was not better. I was just surviving. And another couple of psychotic episodes finally got me, you know, it got through to me that I did have this ongoing issue that I really, really needed help with, that I clearly, you know, hadn't addressed. And by then, when I actually was willing to get a good therapist, like the kind of therapist that could actually help me, I came across two problems. One, the only therapists who were actually qualified to treat me didn't take my insurance. And two, the ones who could take my insurance were not qualified and so inundated by people who also, like me, were on shitty insurance so that they couldn't take on new clients anyway. Like it got to the point where like they were just so full at those clinics and losing staff so rapidly that they could only take on so many people. And there'd be this waiting lists going on for like 6 months at a time. And I wound up in this time frame of about 11 months where I applied to therapist after therapist. I got rejected by like a dozen of them. And I just, you know, took it over to, you know, whatever higher power there is and worked on it myself. In that time that I didn't have a therapist to guide me through what I needed to do, I did it for myself. I learned dialectical behavioral therapy and I taught myself that. I got the workbook and I watched videos on YouTube and I literally like made, I talk about these cards all the time because they're a game changer, but I made all of these like self-care cards. And they're distress tolerance techniques that I got from DBT. They're actual techniques that you can use when you're in, say, an anxiety attack, which happens to me a lot. And they say things like write a letter or journal, take a bubble bath, go outside and listen to nature sounds. They basically just coax you into, you know, getting out of your mood state, which was great because at the time my borderline personality disorder was so destructive that I was having these mood episodes every day, multiple times a day, screaming, crying, hyperventilating for hours. It would take a long time to go through it and to recover from it. It would be the whole day gone and I needed help. And because I couldn't get it through therapy, I just took it upon myself to do the work by myself, for myself, without outside help. Eventually, I got a therapist. One of my friends was like, oh, you can't find a therapist? I have a great one. And I got in to see her, and it was a short-term process. She only sees patients for 6 months. So it's very short-term, and it's goal-oriented. So it's not just talking every week. It's trying to meet a solution. So you set a goal at the beginning of those 6 months and try to reach it at the end of the 6 months. Given what I was going through with the borderline, I really just needed help with my daily life, and I needed help going outside in public without having meltdowns in the grocery store, and I needed help with distress tolerance. Like I said, I needed help with actually learning how to function on a day-to-day basis, which up until that point I wasn't able to. And after 6 months of doing that, I not only drastically improved because she was the first therapist who really got it, who really addressed things, who really helped. I got through that and then found out that it wasn't enough. Despite all the progress I had made, a lot of progress, it still wasn't enough. She realized why I was struggling, like why these issues were a part of my daily life. I have a lot of untreated trauma and it had never been addressed. And she said, you really need trauma therapy. Have you ever worked on your trauma in therapy? I said, no. She was like surprised because it's like pretty obvious that there's something going on with my past. And so she said, look, here's the thing. I can only see you for 6 months, but there's a loophole. We'll wait 3 months and then I want you to get another referral to see me and we'll work on your trauma and we'll go into EMDR. And this was like, it was just like the rays of sun coming through the clouds, because this is what I've needed all along from the start, from the first therapist, through the treatment, through the bullshit of people who didn't help, from people who literally gaslit me, to finally be told, I see you, I see what you're going through, I will literally be the first to validate that this is what you need, and I will get you what you need. So she was a godsend. It's been a few months and I got the referral to see her again. However, it's a very long waiting list, so I won't be able to see her for another several months. But you know what? I am doing so much better, especially because of those 6 months before, that I'm relatively okay. I mean, I'm still disabled, but I'm getting by. And so in the meantime, I've been applying for group therapies. I got waitlisted for one, trying to get into childhood trauma group therapy, and that's just the next step forward. So group therapy, EMDR, another 6 months with this awesome therapist. That's where I'm at now. And it is finally helping. I'm finally going through therapy and getting the help I need for the first fucking time in like 15, 16 years. It's been a bit of a journey and I've definitely learned a lot. One thing I've learned is that I'm capable of incredible things, and that despite having a severe mental illness, I can function better, I can recover more. I don't know that I'll ever be like completely able, right? Like I may always be disabled, but I've accepted that. I'm okay with that. I've made a life that I'm comfortable with, that I'm happy with, that accommodates my disability. So, I'm not ashamed to be psychiatrically disabled. I don't feel as bad about it as I used to. I've also learned that I am certainly not unique for having had the horrible experiences in therapy that I've had. And I recognize that there are a multitude of people just like me who are severely mentally ill. Now, we're not just talking mentally ill, we're talking a severe mental illness that are not getting the adequate care they need because they can't find someone who's qualified. And yeah, there are a lot of people who are not qualified to even touch our cases. So it's absolutely not uncommon to be hurt through the process of therapy by people who just don't know what they're doing, who don't even know how to start taking care of a person with such great needs. Severe mental illness is different. It's very different. It's not common to have multiple identities in one body. It's not common to have obsessions and compulsions that leave you traumatized and take over your life. That's rare, and I just feel like I wish there were more specialists for that, because I know I had a really hard time finding anyone that would deal with psychosis, let alone a combination of these complex disorders, the complexity of all of them together. And I've still never found anyone who could help me with all of my issues. So severe mental illness, it's more difficult to treat. It's harder to get the care you need. I know it's absolutely possible because I've finally found someone who can help me through that. But you need a little extra care. This isn't just going and talking about your week. How was your week? This is what I did. This is healing from things that are beyond most people's comprehension. I hope that if you're like me and you struggle with severe mental illness, that you find the care you need, that you get the care you deserve, and that you don't have to go through the trauma of dealing with therapists and clinicians and social workers that are not qualified to help you, because you can get the care you need. It's just harder to find. And do not settle. Do not settle for a doctor who cannot help you. Do not go for week after week after week for years seeing someone who cannot help you. Go find the one you need. They're out there and you deserve it. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you for sticking around till the end of this video. I appreciate you. If you can relate, if you have any experiences to share, if you have any thoughts, please drop them in the comments below. And as always, like and subscribe. I come out with new videos every Monday and Thursday, so stick around. There'll be another one coming out soon. Bye.